Hello, I'm Samuel Clarke, and I'm here to present our work on differentiable rendering and identification of impact sounds, a project we call Diff Impact. I want to start off by trying to illustrate to you your own mental intuition about impact sounds. Here I show an adversarial example for inferring materials from vision only. One of the glasses here is in fact plastic, and one of the seemingly steel forks is plastic as well. So now I'm going to play this clip, and if you listen carefully, you'll hopefully be able to classify the materials of these cups. And if you listen especially carefully, you may even be able to classify the materials of the forks. Uh, Great. If we could have heard that, if you could successfully classify the materials of the glasses, what you could imagine how you could have done this, and it's going to have a dollar sound. So if you could successfully classify the materials of the glasses, what you likely just mentally did is called source separation. When the glasses were each struck with a fork, you never heard the impact sound of the glass itself, but rather heard the combination of sound of both the glass and the fork. Yet you were still able to mentally attend to the sound of the glass to classify it. And perhaps you could have even done this if there were noise or conversation occurring in the background of the recording. So, could you also go to the next slide for me too? Okay. So if you go through more thought experiments like this, you may realize that humans generally have a very powerful intuition for mentally reasoning over forward and backward problems relevant to impact sounds. So how can we give this kind of capability to robots? Well, first off, let's look to prior work to examine foundations we could build upon for structuring our reasoning about impact sounds and doing this kind of inference. Existing model-based methods for rendering impact sounds fit physically interpretable parameters, which can be more easily transferred between tasks or used to extrapolate or hallucinate unheard sounds. But these either require controlled recordings, such as striking objects with small pellets, or they are not differentiable and thus can only optimize over a few parameters at once. On the other hand, deep learning-based methods, mainly coming from human speech synthesis applications, can learn from data in the wild, but the parameters they learn are uninterpretable. More recently, in 2020, a team at Google debuted DDSP, a differentiable audio renderer designed for musical instrument sounds, which they showed could learn interpretable parameters from data in the wild. But these parameters were relevant to music and not as relevant to the physical properties of rigid objects evident from impact sounds. Diff Impact brings the advantages of differentiable rendering to impact sounds, using the techniques of model-based methods to achieve sample efficiency and physically interpretable and transferable parameters, yet being fully differentiable to learn from data in the wild like deep learning-based methods. But at this point, you may be wondering why we care about physics-based models with interpretable parameters. If we can extract physically interpretable parameters about objects, tools, contacts, environments, etc., we can easily reuse the parameters to extrapolate and simulate new impact sounds using new combinations of parameters about contact conditions, objects, and environments. Oh, sorry. To see how we can extract these physically interpretable parameters from controlled recordings, let's consider the physics of impact vibrations. It turns out that an impact sound can be broken down into two main components: the extrinsic forces acting on an object, or the impact force profile, and the intrinsic acoustic model of an object, that is, its impulse response. The convolution of these two components is the most fundamental aspect of an impact sound. Other components, such as background noise and reverberation, are also big contributors, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll mainly focus on the forces and the impulse response. If we can decompose an impact sound into each of these components, we can infer important properties of objects and how they were contacted. Then, as I showed earlier, we could even specifically swap out the impact or object parameters to simulate new sound in a new acoustic environment. But decomposing an impact sound into these constituent contributions is an ill-posed problem since we're essentially trying to perform a deconvolution. The key idea behind diff impact is that we can bias the decomposition of impact sounds by using physics-based models to provide both a helpful model bias and extract physically interpretable parameters. So I'll start by focusing on how we parameterize the impact force profile with a physics-based model. The first thing to know about impact forces is that they are generally not ideal impulses. They have different sharpnesses to them depending on the velocities, shapes, and hardnesses of the colliding objects. So we use a Hertzian half-sine model of contact forces, which can be parameterized with the timing of the impact, the scale or magnitude, and the time constant tau, which represents the sharpness of the impact. More specifically, we use a Gaussian approximation of this model, which has the same parameters but has smooth derivatives. We model an impact force as a linear combination of m impact events, each parameterized by the three parameters I just illustrated, to create a time sequence of multiple impact events. So next, I'll explain the physical model behind the object impulse response. Rigid object vibrations are well modeled by modal vibration models, which are based on spring damper models of a network of particles within the objects. As shown here, each object has multiple modes of vibration occurring simultaneously, with each mode vibrating with a different frequency, initial gain, and damping. So an object's impulse response can be expressed as just a sum of exponentially decaying sinusoids. Diff impact models this by assuming the impulse response of an object is a finite impulse response, which is a linear combination of n modes, where each mode has only three scalar parameters: a frequency, a damping, and a gain. So I've explained the physical models we use for the impact force profiles and the object impulse response, which we convolve together to get an impact sound waveform. So the main thing that's left to do is explain the loss we're optimizing against. For our loss, we compute magnitude and log magnitude spectrograms of the original ground truth audio, and then compute the same for the audio synthesized by our model, and then take the L1 difference between the two. So now let's see how this plays out on an example of a studio recording of striking a ceramic mug multiple times. Here's the original recording. We're all going to say a prayer here. So to model and extract parameters from this real recording, we start by initializing a random series of impact forces and a random impulse response, which are convolved to get a running estimate of the synthesized waveform. We take the spectrogram of this and then compute the L1 loss against the ground truth spectrogram and adjust the parameters of the upstream models during the gradient descent optimization. Here I'm going to kick off that optimization. And here we have estimates of the extrinsic impact forces and intrinsic object impulse response, which result in the following synthesized clip. Now our full model is a little more complex than this, and I'm happy to explain in more detail if you find me at the poster session. For now, suffice it to say that we also parameterize models for the background noise and the reverberation and combine them into the final audio, so you can extract those two components of the impact sound recording as well. We evaluate our model in three different applications. First, showing that we can learn from controlled recordings in a studio, just like existing model-based methods. We next show a passive learning use case where diff impact can outperform existing deep learning-based methods to enable a robot to learn acoustic models of objects passively from data in the wild. And finally, we show an interactive learning example where diff impact can equip a robot to learn separated acoustic models from impact sound recordings it collects in a noisy robotics lab. First, I'll show examples from the experiment on controlled recordings. We wanted to show that diff impact can match real impact sounds, and that because of its physics-based model bias, it can infer physically meaningful quantities about the impact. We took recordings of hitting everyday objects with an impact hammer to record both audio and ground truth impact forces on the objects. Diff impact then fits a modal response for each object and makes an estimate of the impact force profile over time using only the ground truth audio as supervision. Here we show how well our model can re-render the sounds made by the ceramic mug. Our model is also able to infer relative impact forces that closely approximate ground truth using only audio as supervision. Here's the ground truth recording. And here's diff impact's generated output. Our next experiment shows how diff impact can enable a robot to learn passively acoustic models from in-the-wild impact sound data with many imperfect impacts through an end-to-end learning task. We first curated a dataset of audio from ASMR videos where the creator is finger tapping different everyday objects. We then used diff impact as a rendering layer in an autoencoder for impact sounds. Our model and all baselines were given the ground truth magnitude only spectrogram as input, then were trained to reproduce the sound from the spectrogram using ground truth audio as supervision. We compared our autoencoder based on diff impact to other autoencoding baseline frameworks which were designed for musical instruments or human speech audio. For our evaluation, we performed human studies where we showed our participants the original ASMR video redubbed with audio synthesized by each of the different models, then asked them to choose which redubbed video looked and sounded more realistic in a forced choice. So here's an example of a redubbed video where the ASMR creator is tapping a ceramic plate. Here's the video with the original audio. The audio from our DDSP Sarah baseline, which is from a differentiable renderer with models designed for musical instrument sounds. And the audio from WaveGlow, a flow-based model-free deep learning architecture designed for synthesizing human speech. This baseline better approximates ground truth, but you may notice some high-frequency noise in the audio. And finally, here's diff impacts audio, which has much cleaner transients and impact sounds than the alternatives. We hope you agree with the participants in our human studies that diff impact produced the most realistic redubbing compared to the alternatives. For our final experiment, we showed how a robot can use diff impact to learn acoustic models of objects interactively by striking them together in a noisy robotics lab. To collect impact sounds of objects, the robot strikes different household objects with different household tools. If you remember back to the thought experiment with the wine glasses at the beginning, when the tool and the object strike each other, the resulting sound is some composition of both the sounds made by the tool and the sounds made by the object. But soon, I'll show you that the robot can use diff impact to separate the sounds of these objects from each impact it sounds it hears. Then use these separated sounds to better classify materials and infer properties about them, just like you did in the thought experiment at the beginning. Here are the results from separating the sounds from a steel fork striking a ceramic mug. The fork and mug make very similar sounds, but diff impact is still able to capture their differences. Here's a video. Now, when the microphone's recording, note that there is still some robot motor noise. In order to separate the sound sources, our model composes its sound by fitting acoustic models for both the object and the tool, as well as the background noise, combining all these elements to produce the final sound. So we can just turn off the background noise to generate the denoised version. And we can turn off the mug's contribution and isolate the fork contribution to get only the estimated fork sound. And here we do the same to isolate the mug sound. Along the way of synthesizing the sounds of impact, diff impact has fit an acoustic model for each object. Here are diff impact's synthetically separated impact sounds from each object. Here's the ceramic mug again, the polycarbonate cup, the steel bowl, and the wood holder. And here are example separated sounds from each of the tools. Note that these sounds have all been separated from a clip of each tool striking a much louder object, which dominated each recording with its impact sound. Here's the ceramic chopstick, the polycarbonate spoon, the steel fork, and the wood spoon. At the beginning of this presentation, you imagined mentally separating impact sounds to classify materials of the wine glasses. Similarly, our model separates sources of these pairwise impact sounds, and here we'll see an example of something this can do for manipulation robots. We first constructed a classifier to classify materials from sound and trained it using a publicly available dataset of purely synthetic impact sounds. Here's the classification accuracy we get from trying to classify materials from the original audio. Here's the accuracy from separated object and tool sounds from each object with our model-free source separation baselines. And finally, here we have the accuracy from using sound separated by diff impact. Diff-impact similarly outperforms our baselines for being used to regress Young's modulus from separated sounds. Estimating such properties before manipulating an object can inform the robot about how it can safely and effectively manipulate the object. Finally, to summarize the key takeaways here, Diff-impact uses physically interpretable parameters which can be used for simulation and extrapolation. It's differentiable, so it can learn from recordings in the wild. And then it can solve many dual forward and backward problems with just one framework. And then use these results for important downstream tasks in robotics, such as material classification and stiffness estimation. And with that, I'd like to thank both my co-authors and the others who made this work possible. It took a village, and open things up for questions.
There's a question here. So how important is it to initialize your model in the right vicinity when you do the differentiation? I mean, you have all these different modes, right? The harmonics and so on. So I guess there are like a lot of local minimas that you can run in. Yes, that's very true. It was important to initialize, and I did have to tune some hyperparameters. For example, if you make the gain on the filtered noise too high initially, then it will just try to fit filtered noise to whatever sounds it hears and stuff. So that was a little sensitive to initialization. Fortunately, it wasn't too sensitive, such I didn't have to spend a few months tuning hyperparameters, and I was able to use the hyperparameters for all this, the same hyperparameters for all these recordings. But yes, their initialization is important.
One more.
Can you comment on the sample efficiency of your methods and also maybe potential transfer without having to interact with every single kind of object?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. Actually, so I showed 3 experiments. The first was the analysis by synthesis experiment, where I showed a 3-second clip. That was trained only on that 3-second clip. So it overfits, but the impulse response is the impulse response. Then with respect to the ASMR data set, each of those was about a 5-minute long clip of a bunch of imperfect impacts because she taps it slightly different each time with her fingernail, fingertip. Then finally, the source separation, I had 4 objects by 4 tools, so 16, and I had 2 samples for each object. Each audio recording was less than 2 seconds, so about 60 seconds of total data just to fit all of those acoustic models of the object. So that was part of the advantage of this differentiable model-based renderer, was the sample efficiency.
I think people on the chat don't hear you.
Could you say something about the importance of the geometry of the object that you hit? I can imagine it makes a huge difference if I hit the handle or the bottom or the rim.
Yes, so the person on the, oh, do you want to go? Go ahead.
I just need, because people on the chat need to. So the question is about the geometry of the objects. How much does that influence the method?
Yes, that is very important. As I showed in one of those slides, I showed the modal vibrations. So those heat maps were of the gain. So if you strike in different locations on the object, you're going to excite all of the modes at different gains, so initial values. So since we didn't have that data we didn't have labels for where they were struck, we just assumed that the object had one unified impulse response. That's not necessarily intrinsic to our model, though. It's all a matter of the upstream parameters that get passed to it. So our model has provisions for modeling those, and such as like an implicit model or something like that. It's just a matter of passing in the gains to our differentiable modal impulse response generator.
Follow-up question or no? Good. There's one more there.
Hi, do you think this model could be used like in the opposite direction to have a robot touch slightly with some kind of tool objects and help classify the materials?
It could touch 2 objects?
No, whether the robot with some sort of tool can like hit objects and based on the sound use it to classify materials of the objects.
Yes, I think if the robot had a known tool, I mean, here we just had we did like a cross product of these tools and objects, and especially if the robot had a known tool or even just its own end effector and had an acoustic model of that, then it could more easily just separate out the sound from that. And yeah, so a new query object would be that much quicker to classify. Maybe you wouldn't even need 2 trials or something like that.
I have a similar question to the one over there about the geometry of the objects. So you represented the spectrum as a, say, sine series. And of course, normally the modal vibrations come from the Laplacian eigenfunctions on the domain of the object. So if you're solving it on a drum, for example, you get the bezel functions arising. So could you use some kind of photogrammetry? Would the performance of the model be improved if you use some kind of vision technique to kind of build a model of the object and then found the Laplacian eigenfunctions to try and get a more accurate picture of the spectrum? Would that help?
Yes, I think it would. If we did assume that we did try to model these different impulse responses, yes, I think that could definitely help. That would be challenging because, I mean, contact detection from video is hard in the first place, let alone pose estimation while you're holding it. So we kind of stayed away from the hard problems in vision and focused on the hard problems in audio. And I think that is the next step, to go back to the hard problems in vision, which we hope are kind of jump-started by these kind of interpretable parameters being a bottleneck.
Cool, but it's a really cool project. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have one more question from the chat. Rudolf?
Hey, we already talked a little bit about the impact of the shape on the method, and there's a question from Dylan touching that. Can you comment a bit on the ability of these models to identify certain object properties, for instance, the size of the object or actually the shape itself?
Right. So I think that is... So we extracted a bunch of physically interpretable parameters, which just, model the impulse response through these modes and everything. And I think there are some analytical techniques that you could use to directly work over those. What we showed in our paper, however, was just that using these tools, we could clean out the sounds better and use like kind of more black box methods, just off the shelf regression networks or classifiers to do something like scale detection. So theoretically, you could train a scale detector network on a bunch of data, and then perhaps diff impact could be used on the data that had essentially been cleaned through the algorithms that diff impact offers. On the other hand, I think down the road, it would be interesting to use the physically interpretable parameters to directly estimate some of those important properties through analytical techniques. For example, if we know the damping of each mode, given the frequency, theoretically, under the Rayleigh damping model, we should be able to predict some important features about the density and also the alpha and beta value of the acoustic alpha and beta values of the materials. So I think that is something that could be used, but right now there's a really large sim to real gap in audio simulation. So we have to figure that one out first.
Okay, thank you, Samuel, again for the very interesting talk.